as we start to think about how Judaism has grown throughout the centuries, we normally define it within two commonwealths. The first commonwealth is Moses receiving the law at Mount Sinai, to the destruction of Judah and the dispersion by the Babylonians in around 587 to 541 BC. So this is kind of the golden age of Judaism. And with that dispersion comes a lot of changes, like we talked about before. So with that dispersion, we then move to the Second Commonwealth, which starts in about 515 BC. So there's a period of time that goes by, and then the rebuilding of the temple in around 515 BC. And that Second Commonwealth runs to about 70 AD. Now, with 70 AD, we have the destruction of the temple, and we move into what is called the time of the diaspora. And this is with that destruction of the temple, the Jewish people once again get spread out throughout the world and begin to live and take up residency all over the world, and because they're no longer in the land, right? So those commonwealths are time in the land. Now, some scholars will argue that Israel is now in the third commonwealth because of the state of Israel. And so Israel is now a state. It's a country to itself, and so people will argue that it's in its third commonwealth. Now, with the destruction of the temple, we have a move to what we would call Rabbinic Judaism. What happened is that with the destruction of the temple, of course, we lost temple worship. And so all of the Sadducees, their job was temple worship. The priest's job was temple worship. Everything was revolved around the temple. But now with the destruction of the temple, the Sadducees go out, the party of the priests go out, the Zealots are wiped out in 73 AD in Masada, and the Herodians and the Essenes don't ever have much popular support. So what you're left with basically is the Pharisees, those of the law. And so Judaism today is Judaism of the Pharisees. It's not the Sadducees, it's of the Pharisees, because it's Judaism based on law. So with the destruction of the temple, we no longer have a need or an ability to do temple worship. We no longer have an ability to continue with the sacrificial system. So what is going to grow out of that is more of the rabbinical law system. And so this is what we have in Judaism today. Now, the first step in establishing rabbinical Judaism was an establishment of what became the Old Testament for us, because we use the exact same books that are used by the Jews as their sacred scriptures there in the Old Testament. This matter was taken up in an enclave of rabbis in the Mediterranean town of Yavna. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai received permission from the Romans to begin to develop what would be considered the sacred writings of the Jewish people following the years of 80-90. We don't have exact transcripts of what took place during that time, but what we understand is that according to ancient tradition, all the books that have been used in the inspired writings were considered with an eye towards settling once and for all whether or not they should be accepted into the sacred canon. And so this begins a debate and a discussion of what should be considered canonical and what would be considered apocrypha. So this began that discussion and the development. The emerging Christian community accepts the books that are recognized at Yavne. And so these are the same books. The Christian community accepts these same books as what is considered to be what is the Old Testament in our Bibles is the same as what is considered to be sacred texts within the Old Testament or the Bible of the Jewish people. Once that's been decided, then it's time to collect the writings, the interpretations of the law that had accrued over the centuries, and this becomes the Mishnah. And so through a series of different meetings and debates and different rabbis and a number of different events, the Mishnah is developed, and it's divided up into 6 categories that relating to seeds, harvest, and planting. So that would be the first one. The second one would be feasts. What are what are feasts? How are feasts done? How are they celebrated? The third would be relationships to women. What's the relationship between a man and a woman, a husband and a wife, and just general issues related to women. Damages is the fourth. Other holy matters is the fifth. And then purities is the sixth. So the Mishnah is covering these different issues related back to the Torah, related back to what is considered to be the Old Testament. This becomes then the halakha, or the halakhic tradition. Halak, means the law. So this is how the development of the law of the rabbis or of Judaism begins to take place. And it is interpreted, it is established, and it is developed. Right? So, for an example, at the Passover, when we talk about ridding the house of yeast, what does that mean? And so this tradition is developing, there are different types of makeup that have yeast in it. So what can be used, what can't be used? How do you get the yeast out of the cracks in the table? All of these different laws, all of these different rules based on how you're supposed to live and the things that you're supposed to do. And so this aspect is continued to be developed, right? Because you're not allowed to work on the Sabbath, for an example. So how does that relate then to driving? How does that relate to turning on and off lights? How does that relate to your oven? So for an example, a friend of mine works for GE, and he said that on all GE appliances, on all GE ovens, there is a Sabbath switch. And so what a Jew can do so that they don't light their oven on the Sabbath, they can light it before the Sabbath and leave it on. Most of our ovens have an off switch. After it's been left on for a certain period of time, it'll flip itself off so that nothing bad happens. But this switch will keep that on for 24 hours. And so these are extra laws, extra rules that have to continually be developed in order to determine how it is that the people are supposed to, how they're supposed to live. All right, so we have the Mishnah and the Mishnah and the Gemara, the Mishnah and the Halakha. The Gemara is Gemara. Is how people are supposed to live. It's more of a story form, and all of that makes up the Talmud. So the Mishnah and the Gemara make up the Talmud. So the Mishnah being the law and the legal interpretations, the Gemara being the narratives and the illustrations. So this makes up the extra set of all of the holy books, all of the writings that Jews are supposed to follow as they serve and as they live out their lives as believers. Now, in the 7th century, Shiite Islam forced the Jewish culture to take root in the Iberian Peninsula. So that's the peninsula of Spain and Portugal. So Shiite Islam actually pushed the Jews towards Europe, and there was an establishment of a heavy Jewish population then in Europe as a result of Islam. The Umayyad dynasty, Muslim dynasty, forced that to take place. During that time, then, after the 7th century, as we move into the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries, we have, of course, the Crusades there in the latter part. Many of the Crusaders practiced their crusading skills on Jewish populations that were in Western Europe, what would be to us Western Europe at that time. There was a development of Judaism during that time called Kabbalah. You may have heard of Kabbalah. It's completely distinct from what is Kabbalah in the United States. But Kabbalah is the mystical aspect of Judaism. So this was developed, and it was an attempt to unmediate or to link to the absolute. So the Kabbalah tradition was developed where there was direct vision that was given from God. The book Zohar is the book of splendor written by Moses de Leon, which is a book of mystical writings and development of just a mysticism within Judaism. And The gematria was developed at that time. Of course, gematria is the numbers. And so you may have looked or studied or read about numbers within the Bible and how certain numbers add up to certain things. So, the number 7 is perfect and relates to God. The number 3 is the number of man, and 7 plus 3 is 10, which is the world, or something along those lines. So anyway, just the whole gematria, the numbering system within the Bible. And this was just a way of developing culture. In 1492, we had further developments as Moses sailed for the Americas. Of course, 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. So as he went to the Americas, Spain took itself back. It at that time was under Islamic rule, or half of it was under Islamic rule. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabel took Spain as a whole in 1492, kicking out all of the Muslims. But they didn't just kick out all the Muslims. They also kicked out or killed all of the Jews that were in Israel at that time, as well as all of the gypsies that were in Israel, or in Spain at that time, I'm sorry. So it was an ethnic purging of all of Spain, which forced a number of Jews into North Africa, or they took off from Spain and went up north into France. From that period, we have what's called the Sephardic Jews. The Sephardic Jews are a group of Jews that spoke Spanish or today speak Spanish. Their Spanish dates back to the 1400s. It is exactly like that Spanish. So it's an unintelligible Spanish to the average Spanish speaker because it's such an ancient form of the language, but it is Spanish. A good friend of mine, his wife is a Sephardic Jew. She became a believer when she came to the United States, but she knows that form of Spanish. She brilliant woman, and she has that form because she's Sephardic in her past. And her father was taken into the prison camps when he was a boy, and very, very much a strong Jew. And of course she was as well until she came to the States where she got saved. So the Sephardic Jews, today they live also in Israel, but maintain a very distinct cultural presence. The Ashkenazic Jews were also some who were forced up into Europe. They went into northern and northeastern Europe, and they developed Yiddism. So also a linguistic people group that are Jewish. So for an example, if you watch Fiddler on the Roof, or ever want to watch a very old movie, this is about the Ashkenazic Jews, the Yiddish, and so you'll hear that term periodically. All right, so the Jews continue their development. A number of different things develop out of them, and you can read about that here in this chapter, chapter number 16. Just the whole developments, the different pieces, the different groups, the different traditions that develop out of Judaism as time goes on, and as the Jews are separate, try to become a part of culture, try and be distinct from culture, trying to live out their faith in unique ways.